It's Ramadan.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. In this segment, we're going to be focusing on politics in the Western Cape. So just recently, John Steenhuisen had been warning Western Cape voters to either vote for a DA majority in the province or face corruption consequences with coalition politics. It was an emphatic statement that raised a lot of responses from smaller and bigger political parties. And today to chat with us and to unpack just the landscape of the Western Cape, we have ASRI Director of Research, Angelo Fick. Angelo, assalamu alaikum and good day.
Wa alaikum salam to you and to your listeners.
Great. So, Angelo, we know that the Western Cape is a very, very contested space. There are a lot of smaller political parties that are trying to claim a stake. We also know that there is a bit of fluidity in the Muslim vote, specifically in the Western Cape, and that is largely because of what is happening in Palestine and in Gaza, and people are looking for a political home. So with all of that context, how do you interpret what John Steenhuisen said? Is it a statement of desperation or is it something else?
So there must clearly be some anxiety in the Democratic Alliance if the leader of the party seems to feel the need to, ahead of a contestation, denigrate potential opposition parties. Now, the Democratic Alliance is governed with smaller parties in the city of Cape Town as far back as 2009. And so I think it is important to recognize that this is, I think, revealing of not just John Steenhuisen, but of the Democratic Alliance apparatus that it feels to play the need to play this game. It's also ironic that the assumption is that other parties coming into the Western Cape is likely to be the cause of corruption, particularly with the recent finding that Cape Town is among the cities, including Johannesburg and Tshwane, in which corruption has been noted as a significant component of civic life. And Patricia de Lille, a former member of the Democratic Alliance and before that of the Independent Democrats and now leader of Good, has gone on television suggesting that there is a more sophisticated way of stealing in the Western Cape under the DA. And so it'll be interesting to see how voters respond precisely to what feels to me and looks to me like a really bad public relations move on the part of the Democratic Alliance in this province in which it has such a stronghold.
So the irony is you mentioned Patricia de Lille, but even if you reference the first biography of Helen Zille, she also references sort of embedded corruption that was in the Western Cape, in the city of Cape Town when she emerged as both the mayor and the premier. So it shows that even from back then. And obviously she was talking here, or the reference was made to an apartheid-style apparatus that hadn't been dismantled by the time that she took over power. And now obviously we know that is almost 20 years has gone since those days. And now we're hearing from Patricia de Lille, which is probably in the last 10 years, that a lot of that is still in place. That being said, though, if we zoom into just the landscape of political parties in the Western Cape, we have a lot of small ones emerging. And we possibly have ones that could stake a claim based on ethnic-based politics. So we have the NCC that I think in certain colored strongholds are gaining momentum. We have Al Jamaa that I think will pick up a lot of votes within the context of the Palestinian struggle and people feeling we're not really sure who should vote for. And then we have seen, I think, emergence of two or three other parties. So we have the PMC headed by Marius Fransman, who we know is an electioneering genius in historically from the ANC. We have Ahmed Mansour Sheikh Imam, who's a sitting MP that has launched the Allied Movement for Change with a very credible and public-facing candidate for Premier in the Western Cape in the name of Faisal Sayed. And then we also have, on the flip side, the former Speaker of the Western Cape Legislature, Masazole. So we have different people that probably appeal to different segments of the population in the Western Cape. My question is, does that fragment the vote? And if it does, what does that actually mean in terms of place or pushing a challenge to the DA?
So I think we need to be careful about suggesting that a plethora of parties fragments voting. I think what has happened, and this is partly the failure of post-apartheid South Africa, is that South Africans have been fragmented and atomized into these ethno-nationalist categories. And the things that we have in common with one another is not something that either the existing governing party or any of the opposition parties have been able to use to rally us together, across differences of class or race or ethnicity or language, and gather us together in terms of our interest in making a life, despite those differences, because of our commonalities. And here I think the atmosphere, the milieu, the context has been ripened over the last 30 years for this emergence. And this is not just local in South Africa, but it's global, in which politicians are calling upon people's fears and attaching those fears to identities, and then are able to exploit that in order to get those people to vote for them in compartmentalized processes. Now, we know that the larger parties have tried to appeal to voters in these blocks for the last 2 or 3 decades. They go to one space and speak in one voice, they appear in another space and they speak something completely different. Class and race and ethnicity has often played a role here. So in the Western Cape, this is often considered to be either the coloured vote or the working class vote. And I think it is important for us to recognize that there is a class element here, and that people have voted in terms of their perceived class interests. And so the legacy of apartheid that Helen Zille cites is not a legacy that, or the apartheid style apparatus that she suggests was prevalent when she came into power, goes back into colonialism. Corruption has been a component of governance in what is now the Western Cape and its predecessor, the Cape Colony and the Cape Province, for as long as those have existed. There have been objections as far back as the 1820s to Lord Charles Somerset's governance, and there have been concerns around people like Cecil John Rhodes. Olive Schreiner was a major opponent of his work at the turn of the century. So this idea that corruption is a post-apartheid phenomenon is something that I think has to be naysayed by the material evidence. And then secondly, the fragmentation of the vote is done by political parties and politicians when they construct South Africans in these categories that don't really hold true and speak a truism that erases the truth of people's ordinary lives.
That is actually really good reflection. So within the context of the Western Cape, I think we're sitting, if we're to fragment according to racial categories, we're sitting on about, I think, 38, close to 40% Black African, and then we're sitting just over 40%, I think between 45 and 48% in terms of colored African. So my question is historically what has happened is, or the allegation. So on the one side, there's an allegation by the DA that an attempt has been made to ensure that there's an influx of people from the Eastern Cape to break the mold of politics in a particular way. That was what they said when the ANC ran the Western Cape and the city of Cape Town. We're seeing some of that conversation re-emerging. So that's the first side. But on the flip side, you have technically a colored majority in the Western Cape that is never really voted as a holistic bloc. Do you envision that will happen in this election? Do you also, and obviously to take it back to the DA, do you think that they have lost the support of their base in the Western Cape, which is largely a particular class of colored people?
So there are 3 questions that you raised there. I'll answer them in order. The movement of people into the Western Cape is the result of the urbanization of South Africans after a century of influx control legislation going back to colonialism and through apartheid, and the forced removal of people and their ethnic identification with places they do not come from. And so to suggest that there is some kind of influx or that people are refugees or that this is orchestrated is to ignore the history and backdrop against which, while the rest of the world was allowed to urbanize, Black South Africans were kept on the rural periphery by colonial and apartheid legislation. The second component is, you're absolutely right, there is no such thing. I really find it kind of interesting that analysts continue to talk about this thing called the colored vote, particularly in the Western Cape, because there are massive class differences between people who live in Crawford and people who live in Bonteheuwel, and those class differences have class interests. There are different language groups, there are different religious beliefs, there are people who have such a massive amount of difference that this idea that a 1950 Population Registration Act can still describe describe people in this way and that their behavior can be explained by this Population Registration Act category is gainsaid by evidence all the time. And I think that people vote in terms of their class interest, people vote in terms of their perceived interest of what they're likely to gain. And that explains the patterns of voting we've seen, not just in the Western Cape, but across the country for people. Otherwise you would have to talk about a Zulu ethno vote. You'd have to talk about Xhosa vote, and that doesn't exist. The third issue that you raise is, I think, important to bear in mind because voters are not irrational creatures, despite what politicians say about them when they lose. This is a moment in which voting patterns could change, but they could change in which the majority parties, having lost the confidence, the bigger parties having lost the confidence of voters, could see those voters move elsewhere. And that is the nature of democracy. If you don't appeal to people, if you don't give them what it is you promise them or what they're asking for, if you continue to segment the population and be seen by those voters to serve segments but not everybody, and this is the case for the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape. It is the case for the African National Congress across the country. For the DA, the perception is often that it is a raced service as well as a class service. For the African National Congress, it is a very small group of people who are beneficiaries or see to be beneficiaries of their governance through the corrupt and catered deployment systems. You should be prepared to have voters walk away. This idea that voters are beholden to you and that you make the kinds of statements that if they don't vote for you, the opposition, the options, the other alternatives are worse is really not a good way to politic. And I think the Democratic Alliance and the African National Congress need to wake up to the reality that voters make decisions based on their perceived interests. And sometimes those interests may not actually be real, but they are perceived, and in their perception, people believe in them. And so to call on people's insecurities, fears, and anxieties, whether in race terms, whether in corruption and crime terms, is unfortunate because it speaks of a desperation to want to continue to play politics in a way that the voters, certainly in their behavior at the ballot box, really are no longer interested in.
So if we look at Ipsos polling or the Ipsos polling of last year, which came out just before, or just came out just after October 7th, but didn't necessarily take into account October 7th, it showed that the DA obviously was below 50%. Now, a lot of analysts are saying that the DA's stance specifically on Palestine has shifted perhaps the middle-class Muslim vote, right? And here I'd like us to unpack what you kind of said with regards to the colored vote, but to use that lens with regards to the Muslim vote, because everybody, specifically in the Western Cape, is courting the Muslim vote with a great deal of veracity. And so the question is we know that the Muslim community, like any other community, is not an homogenous community. It has people with different races, different classes, different backgrounds. And so it is perhaps easier for a middle-class person to say, I'm going to base my vote on the Palestinian issue, which is an international relations issue. But my question consistently is whether or not the working class and the poor and working class Muslim community will actually shift their vote based on that, whether they will stay with the DA or whether they will go, in a different direction. And for me, I found that analysts generally treat it as if the Muslim vote is an homogenous category, much like you said with regards to the colored vote. But I think the statement is clear from most people is that it is possibly the most fluid vote at the moment. And so the question is really, where does it go? And I think it's possibly has different permutations. But what is your thoughts on that?
So my haram crystal ball is not functioning and hasn't functioned for 30 years. I can't predict where people are going to vote. My sense is always that people profess a certain set of beliefs and ideas. Their behavior doesn't always 100% match that. And they weigh up very different interests based on the candidates in front of them, based on what their perceptions of what they're likely to benefit or what harm will come to them, and then the ethical concerns. And this is different from the kinds of, or the issue of the genocide on Gazans is a very different mode of engagement between South African political parties, international relations, and local voters. Many people are dismissing it as it isn't important, it doesn't play a role because international questions do not play a role in local politics. I don't think that that is true. I think it is the worldview that is being revealed by the political players when they talk about Gaza and how that's different from when they talk about Ukraine or when they talk about Yemen or when they talk about Sudan or Congo, plays a role in affecting and influencing voters to see the worldview revealed by organizations and people, and that may shift their behavior. That said, people also will tell pollsters all sorts of things, and on the day will vote in very different ways. The failure of polls to predict the shifts in global politics is significant here. So the history of that is clear. So my sense would be voters will weigh up a variety of issues in looking at the spectacular, the invasion and genocide that's ongoing in Gaza. Analysts may be ignoring very specific, basic, on the ground issues and the connections between those two. So, for the people of Lavender Hill, a working class neighborhood who paint a mural in support of Palestinians, who then have the city come and remove that mural because of its violation of some bylaw ordinance around seeking permission to put up things in public places, that experience of the global in the local is very, very particular. For business people who have business relationships with the city and the province, governed by the DA, their interest may have be to weigh up whether or not they continue to have the benefit of those businesses with the province, or do they give up those beneficiation relationships on the basis of an ethical principle based on a religious belief that they have about the dignity of people and their treatment in Gaza. So my sense is that these will be individual decisions. These will be decisions made by people in debates with one another. But I don't think that there can be a predicted Muslim swing away from the Democratic Alliance towards some other party like the African National Congress, as wishful as the African National Congress may be about such a sort of shift, and as anxious as the Democratic Alliance may be about such a shift. There are all sorts of additional issues which do not discount Palestine, but must be brought into the mix when people are asked about how they're likely to vote. And when we check about, in the wake of May the 20, at the end of May, why it is that people voted the way they do. Because as you've pointed out, there is no one Muslim community, and Muslims do not all agree on the same things. There's some Muslims who will buy hot cross buns at a black and white supermarket, and there are others who simply won't. There are some Muslims who believe that it is, unacceptable to have certain kinds of practices, and there are others who don't. So this idea that there is a Muslim vote to be pursued is, I think, to misunderstand by politicians and political parties people's complex bouquet of needs, desires, wants, and concerns, and not be able to address them coherently. Because here, I think, where the bigger parties are losing out is that for the voters, they're hearing incoherent and inconsistent messaging from organizations and parties on a variety of issues. Gaza, Palestine being one of them, but electricity supply, corruption, crime, business, education, safety, housing, water supply, all of these are spaces in which the bigger parties are giving very, very contradictory messages to voters who then have to, wade through this quagmire of contradictions to figure out which ones they believe and which ones they don't.
That was Angelo Fick, ASRI Director of Research, who was unpacking for us a little bit of the dynamics of politics in the Western Cape. Not really making much predictions or refusing to go into the crystal ball in terms of looking at what the outcome perhaps will be of whether it is the Muslim vote, the colored vote, and who's swinging where. But a really good analysis by Angelo Fick. Shukran so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back soon.
Jazakallah, and have a good Tuesday.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.